This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes.
Hello and welcome to Justice Worriers episode 61. My name's Andy, and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
And we have the pleasure of welcoming Bethany, who is Leah's sister. Say hi, Bethany.
Hi.
And welcome to the pod. We know that you've done some research around the Palestinian situation. So we want to talk about that, but we want to start off by just asking you a bit about your story. So you can take that however you like, but tell us a bit about your story.
Thanks. So I have done a PhD, and that it was looking at an organisation called the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel. And so my focus was on activists who are engaged in human rights work in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, and looking at the ways in which that kind of activism reignited colonial legacies in that work, and what the impact of that was on the efficacy of what they were doing in occupied Palestine. And this was an organisation that I'd volunteered with myself a year or so before I did the PhD work. And so, the research was very much based around my own reflections and experiences of doing that human rights monitoring work, and then moving on with the research from that.
And what led you to volunteer to do that work, if it's all right to ask?
Yeah, so a couple of different things kind of led into that decision. I guess one big influence was before I went back to university, I was an English teacher, and I had a year working in Lebanon. And I was working in the south of Lebanon, where there's a huge number of Palestinian refugees. And I met a lot of Palestinians who obviously talked a lot about the situation in Palestine. And one particular person who I got to know, he used to drive me from my flat to the school that I was teaching in. And he was a Palestinian who had been born in Lebanon, so his second generation refugee from the conflict. And I told him that I'd visited the West Bank a couple of years before, and he'd never been and wasn't allowed to ever go back there. So, and because my Arabic was so limited, the conversation kind of came up in such a way as that I was trying to explain that I'd been to the West Bank, and he was trying to explain how important that piece of land was to him and his family. So all he could do was to pull his car over to the side of the road, get out and pick up a bit of dirt from the ground and say, this is what's so important. This is what I would have you bring back to me if you could go there. Right. So it kind of really impressed on me this geopolitical situation. You know, I was southern Lebanon, so close to the border with Israel in that part. So so that kind of really sparked an interest, and I'd heard about EAPI, which is the short form. So if I say EAPI, that's short for the program that I volunteered with, and decided to volunteer with them with a view to doing some more research. But the other thing, I guess, was that after doing this year in Lebanon, I went back and did a master's. And as part of that master's course, I did a course on the history of the situation in Israel and Palestine. And as part of that, we learnt about the British role in the history of the conflict and of the situation. And we talked about the fact that the year 2017 was approaching at that time, which was a significant year in that history. And so there was a lot of kind of thinking through what does it mean for Britain to to look back over 100 years of involvement in the situation and kind of address that history. And that kind of was something that really stayed with me, I think. Yeah.
Right, fantastic. So could you tell us, I know we're not going to spend as long as we probably should, but could you tell us some of that history, your understanding of it, and I'm particularly interested in the British role. I know that some of your work also touches on what it means to be British with that history.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a bit of the history?
Yeah, a bit of the history, I think, would be the way to describe it. I mean, yeah, so one starting point would be to think back to the 19th century. So the time when there was a move towards nationalisms in general in Europe. There was kind of rise of nationalism, and idea caught hold that had been building for some time that there should or could be a Jewish national home, and this is obviously of importance to those Jewish people living in European countries who had a history of marginalisation and feeling on the outside of society. And so the idea that there could be a national home for Jewish people became particularly popular. And it was towards the end of the 19th century when the first Zionist movement came about. And from that point onwards, so from 1881, there were waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine. But even to rewind before that, when this idea of there being a home for Jewish people as a homeland came about, and the Zionist movement was kind of gathering pace, Palestine wasn't the first choice of location necessarily. So there were also other countries that were proposed along the way. There was Argentina and Uganda, for example. So obviously history unfolded, and Palestine was the place that was chosen. But it came out of this Zionist movement that was seeking a homeland. There were various waves of migration to Palestine, and that was going back from 1881, and then that continued right up until around 1836, at the outset of the Second World War. So there was, in fact...
1936.
Yeah, you meant 1936.
Did I say 18?
Yes.
Yes, 1936. So there was this... and I think this was... I'm kind of talking about this because it's something that really impressed on me when I was learning this history for the first time, that it was contrary to my, I think, previous understanding of how Israel came into being, was that it wasn't only that migration to Israel happened at the time of the Second World War, but that it was happening at the end of the 19th century and onwards. And there was waves of migration, and there was the fifth wave of migration in between 1933 and 1935 that brought the largest number of immigrants to Palestine. And then actually, just as the Second World War was getting started in 1936, there was a repression of there was a harsher policy from Britain at that time, which actually restricted the migration.
So Palestine was under British rule at that point, is that right?
Yes, yeah. So I mean, so there's a lot to.
So just want to talk about Sykes-Picot in that context, right? I mean,
yes.
The sort of betrayal of the hope. So my understanding, and I'm not an expert in the region, was always that, and this also plays into the German history and their mobilization ideas of Islam for jihad on behalf of Germany. And
so what they were trying to create?
They were trying to create jihad and mobilize. Well, the Ottoman Caliph, or the Sheikhul Islam, so the prime legal scholar of the Ottoman Empire, issued a declaration in 1914 that if you're living under Ottoman rule or under Islam anywhere, including India, Egypt, all other places, you need to fight for Germany and against France and Britain. And that was a mobilization attempt that went wrong because, I mean, this idea that you could somehow mobilize Muslims under the Ottoman Caliph of all places to sort of mobilize for war, that never worked. But there was a lot of nervousness already from late colonialism about the political power. So pan-Islam is a term that arises in 1910s. There's a lot of nervousness around the political utility of Islam. And my understanding has always been that then Britain kind of does a counter-mobilization. And they do this around Arab identity. And this is where this whole story, the story of Lawrence of Arabia comes in. And so this kind of, we will mobilize Arab powers against the Ottoman Empire and around Islam. So they get the guardian of the holy sites in Mecca. And so I'd always understood that story to be there to be an understanding that then therefore those areas of the West Bank would be under Arab rule. Something what would then become Saudi Arabia or something under that suzerainty, and that the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was made in 1917 and basically carved up the region in a British sphere of interest and a Francophone or French sphere of interest, was kind of a secret agreement that wasn't revealed until after the First World War and caused a huge disappointment. Not only was the Ottoman Caliph gone and therefore no longer any succession of Muhammad in the entire Islamic world, and that wasn't going to be replaced. And there were movements in India to bring him back, but then also people discovered, hang on, there wasn't going to be self-rule in wider Arabia. Is that roughly correct? Does that play into the story?
It might do. It's not a part of the story that I've looked at in so much detail myself, but I think it sort of touches on the fact that there were multiple agreements being made by different players at slightly different times, both during and towards the very end of the First World War, as the Allies are trying to decide how to carve up the territory that was under the rule of those who were allied with Germany. So there was the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916 that made a certain arrangement of certain parts of Palestine and Jerusalem as the capital to be under international control. But then also importantly in 1917, Lord Balfour, who was the Home Secretary at the time, famously made a declaration to the Zionist movement, which is now called the Balfour Declaration, which was a promise of, so that the British government would view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for Jewish people, and that in doing so it wouldn't do anything that would prejudice the civil and religious rights of any existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
Just a question on, because I think connecting British rule back to the territory. So was the idea, when you say it was put under international control, was this the same kind of construct that was done with German colonies, where it's formally under international control but given to the guardianship of either England or France? Was that the arrangement then?
Yeah, so the idea of putting Jerusalem under international control was part of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which didn't come into force because this, in exactly that way, because this Balfour Declaration of 1917 eventually was drawn into the 1922 League of Nations Agreement, which made Palestine a mandate. So this was an agreement that what was called a new form of colonialism in a way, and the mandate system.
So what's the mandate?
So a mandate would be the idea that, in this case, it was France or Britain had responsibility for countries such as Palestine or Greater Syria, and they had mandate kind of means responsibility in that sense, and that they were given the guardianship, and that word was used, of these countries in order to prepare them for self-determination, so to prepare them for independence eventually. That was the wording of those kind of contracts. So it was another form of colonial rule, but with the kind of benevolence of carrot on a stick, kind of eventually you will be able to have your own independence. We need to just give you some help along the way before we'll allow you to have this.
And they were formally accountable to the League of Nations, which is
Exactly.
also a new idea that comes up at this time that, kind of, at least pro forma, lessens the colonial power. You can't do as you please, you have to report back. But as we know, the League of Nations was a quite weak entity, so that never amounted to much. But the idea was it wasn't colonialism because it had this accountability built into it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really interesting for thinking about a Christian understanding of responsibility, even for the contemporary situation, because at the time there was a lot of kind of religious language used around the contracts or the wording of the mandate system, that it was a sacred trust that countries were entering into, and that they had a moral responsibility to prepare these countries for eventual independence. So the outcome was that this promise of Lord Balfour to the Zionist movement, that they would have their own national home in Palestine, that was made during the First World War, in 1917, then became in the documentation of the League of Nations mandate, so that Britain had this mandate responsibility for Palestine.
So what would people have understood at the time if they were living in Palestine and they were aware of this? Would they have felt that they were going to get self-rule eventually, or were they aware that they might get self-rule as part of what were their lands, and that a Zionist homeland would be in part, or what was the understanding?
I think it's hard to say how much people, the average person in
maybe
Palestine
the sort of people in charge
would have known what the intention was, but I know there was a lot of initial positivity around Britain taking charge, and that the Ottomans had no longer were the rulers, but these promises were certainly made that eventually it would lead to independence. And in the meantime, they had British colonial administrators move into Jerusalem as the head of that. Yeah.
Maybe it's a really obvious point, but I feel like it's worth emphasising, because I've heard people say that the land was empty before this state was established. And it's interesting to hear that even in the Balfour Declaration, there is mention of the people living there. So this was a populated land, is that right?
Yes, definitely. And there were people living in Palestine when it was under Ottoman control and when it was a British mandate, who were Jewish, and it's generally said, fairly good level of cooperation between the Jewish populations and the Arabs who were Christian or Muslim. But this phrase, a land without people for a people without land, is quite commonly talked about as one of the kind of slogans of Zionism. But it's interesting, it was actually first used by Christians in the US and the UK in the 19th century to refer to the Holy Land. So there was these ideas that it was an empty land, or that there weren't people there, but of course there were.
Those that died by wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. Those who died justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. To justify those that died, they're the chosen whites.
I have two questions here. One is, the role of religion in all of this in these early conversations, because as far as I understand, huge parts of the Zionist movement, and certainly Herzl himself wouldn't have described as religious. I mean, it was putting it as a kind of nationalism is also not quite the right term, but it was really built around the notion of common ethnicity and cultural heritage rather than religion. Balfour sounds a bit more religious. And then how does Balfour from there connect with 1922? So those are my two questions. Of what role does religion have to play? Sorry, those are quite large questions, aren't they? And feel free to ignore them. And how does the Balfour Declaration connect with 1922, when it was kind of known that there was sort of an ideological impetus actually behind what Britain might do in the region.
In terms of how the Balfour Declaration ends up as part of the 1922 League of Nations.
Well, I mean, there would have been 5 years in between, right?
Yeah.
So in sort of assigning the mandate to Britain, they would have known about Sykes-Picot in 1916, Balfour Declaration, all these different interests.
Yeah.
So to what extent was that taken into account?
So what happened in 22?
So 1922, there was the League of Nations conference when they did the
What Beth was mentioning earlier with the mandate,
Yeah.
right?
Okay,
Yeah,
so that's when that
so
became
they-
a thing. Okay,
yeah,
right.
so that was kind of the official
Right.
start of the British mandate
Right.
in Palestine.
Okay.
And I'm not knowledgeable enough about the history of Zionism to know much about the role of religion, other than I know that it was largely a secular movement for Zionism in Palestine.
But there weren't alternative ideas being discussed in 1922 about what might happen to the area. I guess that was the nature of my question. So, I mean, by making it a British mandate, it seems that certain directions chosen, or was that not the idea?
But you were saying that the Balfour Declaration was written into the mandate.
Yes.
So I guess that kind of...
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah. So it was, to kind of simplify a very, a history that has many different details, I think, as I understand it, it might have just become the most convenient thing to happen, that there was already this promise to...
Someone was looking to take responsibility.
Yes,
so,
and there'd been this agreement that had been made, and there had been other agreements between different players and with, that kind of got sidelined and,
But it also conveniently mirrors Sykes-Picot in some extent, right? I mean, that's how I understand. Again, my knowledge of the region is quite superficial, but the maps that you see drawn up in Sykes-Picot are eerily similar to what ends up happening in the mandate system.
Yeah, I think I'm not quite sure on the differences, to be honest.
So we're in a situation where this place is now effectively part of the British Empire, but there's this sort of intention for Britain to give up these bits of its empire in a smooth way. Is that the right way of expressing it?
Yes, yeah, I think that was built into the idea of the mandate system. Supposedly, many critics have said, was that ever designed to happen? Because, at that point in time, Britain still had its empire, so did it really want to take on these things with the intention to allow for independence? But the reality of it was that Britain had saddled itself with a near-on impossible task to carry out its promises to the Palestinian peoples and their promises to the Jewish population. So they talk about this kind of dual mandate where they're trying to be this even-handed, impartial governor, overseer, ruler. And there's obviously, to kind of summarise a whole couple of decades worth of the British mandate, it doesn't go well. It doesn't go well. And by coming up towards the end of about 1937, around that kind of time, there's a royal commission. There's various royal commissions to decide how is Britain going to deal with this. There's the Great Arab Rebellion and, more than they can handle. And ultimately, they just give up. That is what
does that look
comes
like?
down to. They say to the League of Nations at the time, we are not able to sustain this, and
effectively we can't keep control of the population.
We can't keep control of these two populations. War had broken out by that time between the Zionists and the Arabs, and they gave up and walk away. And so in 1947, they sort of serve their resignation, if you like, to the League of Nations, and it ends up at that point. It's also when there's so much war in Palestine, the war that then leads to creation of Israel in 1948.
Plus the whole world system is being reconfigured at this point, right? So the League doesn't League of Nations turning into the UN, and I mean everything's up in the air. So there's nobody.
There's no money around in the 30s, so it's not like there's resources to be spent on something that Britain is losing interest in.
Yeah. Did you say 47 or 37?
47.
47.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a partition.
Everybody's pretty much down.
Yeah. And there's a partition plan. So that, there's an idea after one of these royal commissions that there would just be a partitioning so that some of the land would go to the Jewish people and some for the Zionists and some to Palestine. And a green line is drawn up to show where that division would go, but events take over and Israel comes into being in 1948.
So you might not have an answer to this, in which case tell me that. But I'm interested in why it doesn't work. So you said that a long time previous people seem to be living together peacefully with different religions and cultures. And my understanding of some of the ideas around the Israeli state now is that it's really important to some people, at least, that it's a Jewish state specifically, whether that's ethnically or religiously. So is that why it doesn't work? Is that idea in Zionism at the beginning that we can't simply become part of a nation, but we need to have a separate ethnic nation that therefore, is that why it's incompatible to kind of move there and live in peace? Is that very simplistic?
No, I think those ideas certainly animate Zionism, Zionist thinking, and the politics that then becomes Israeli politics. That, and I guess I can speak most comfortably from my own conversations I've had with people, and one I remember having with a rabbi in Israel when I was there was. There's also always been a fear of demographic shift. So for Israelis to find, as she was explaining to us, for Israelis to find themselves in a minority in terms of numbers is kind of inconceivable in terms of the fears that would produce in terms of how they would feel their existence was possible, was livable as such. And so I think some of those, the longing for a national home that is a Jewish nation, and you see that in the outworking of the way Israel functions today, that it has come to function as a Jewish state, and in as such, looking back to the 1930s, 1920s, there was a push for that state to be in existence in those years, so that there would be a feeling of this being a Jewish homeland
and being safe, right? That's what it's behind it, right?
Obviously, as you said, this is happening way before the Second World War, because there is a European history going back to medieval times and probably before, of pogroms and of despicable treatment towards small Jewish populations in European countries, or large but minority Jewish populations in European countries. So that's all.
So becoming a minority in some other country doesn't actually help.
Not what they're after. Not what you're after.
And discrimination is rife even beyond the kind of pogroms that you read about. In the kind of work that I did in German colonialism and in sort of German Orientalism, there were lots of Jews working in the Colonial Office, for example, or in Orientalist professions, the study of Islam, for example. But discrimination was always very, very near around the corner, or actually actively experienced. Herzl, I don't quite know when the last name thing comes in Prussia, but that's also one of the things that plays into this history. Well, Herzl was Austrian, but you were forced to adopt the last name. And this is where then particular names like Hirsch and others become sort of standard Jewish names, and make you also identifiable, because the sort of previous name of Jewish people wasn't to have a last name. So you're kind of forced into these kind of nomenclatures. I see in the files that I studied where people at various ranks would be discriminated against simply because they were Jews, or you wouldn't know. Also, it might be something that's unsaid, but you would guess. So I think that was very much a history of an experience. And then obviously the Holocaust just sharpens that by 1,000 for people.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you.
But maybe also to say, just to link some of this history we talked about back to my own story that you kind of opened with, and I said about how I'd learnt about the year 1917 and then the centenary that had been coming up, 2017, which was the date of the Balfour Declaration, and some of the ways in which I found Palestinians thought about this date and thought about the significance of that date for this current situation was something that I was very struck by, and kind of fed into some of my research. And so one way in which I kind of came across this was when I was volunteering with the IAPI organisation. This was in 2017, so it was exactly the year of the 100th centenary of the date when Britain signed over the Palestinian lands to the Zionist movement. And I would have conversations with people, and they would find out that I was British. And sometimes this is conversations in the West Bank, and their very initial response to me was, "Oh, well, if you're British, well, Balfour, it's all your fault. Are you going to apologise?" Not necessarily always in a kind of confrontational, angry way. Sometimes there was that in the conversation. Sometimes it was jokes. But this sense in which this was living history for Palestinians, I knew about it because I'd studied it. But
that was my first question. Did you actually know about it before it was first mentioned to you?
Yes, because I had done my master's. Yeah, so I'd read about it, but also because of family history. Not family history I was very well aware of, but I knew that I knew a little bit of it in that my Ian Leah's great-grandfather was a soldier with the British Army in the First World War, and we have a diary of his, and it covers his journey in 1917 from Britain across Europe through what would have been war in France at the time, across France into Egypt, was at a camp in Egypt, waiting to get on the move with his unit, and then travelled from Egypt through Gaza to Bethlehem, and was travelling from Bethlehem to Jerusalem on, he says it was the second Sunday of Advent. So I think if I'm right, it was the 9th of December 2017. So that was the day that 1917. Did I say 2017 again? 1917. So that was the day that Jerusalem was captured by the by the British. So he was there early hours of the morning, and he writes in his diary how privileged he felt to be in the Holy Land.
Because he was a man of faith, right?
He was a man of faith. Wow. And the diary is full of references to how, prayers to be kept safe and as you'd expect. But yeah, he wrote that it was a privilege to be there. Later on in that afternoon, there was, the surrender of the city, and British forces took control. And so I'd read some of that diary beforehand. I knew of that history. And then, there's a sense in which you're having then these conversations. I'm there in Palestine 100 years to the year since my great-grandfather had been there. And Palestinians are telling me what impact that British history's had on their current lives. So they're saying to you, you're British, are you going to apologise for Balfour? What do you feel and what do you say? I sometimes tried to laugh it off, I guess, in a kind of, how do I respond to this? Sometimes it was, it was kind of delivered in the form of a joke, but what do you say? It's very hard to, and I think for sometimes I did try and say something about my great grandfather, and I'd known about this, and And of course, you try and say sorry, but you're aware as the words leave your mouth that it means nothing. It's kind of immaterial in that sense.
Can I ask you again about religion and your great-grandfather? What did he think about Temple Mount, Muslims in the city? Like, how religious was he about this? And what is your sense from his diary? How much religion played into this? Was there imagination of Jerusalem? I mean, obviously, it's a history that has all this kind of battle.
So he described it as the Holy Land, did he say?
Yes, he used the term Holy Land. Yeah, he doesn't... The diary is sadly not as detailed as as you'd like it to be, but...
they rarely are.
yeah, so he doesn't kind of comment in that sense, but you do get the impression that he's got this sense of
was he
awe and wonder at being there, in what is a special place for him, certainly he kind of writes hymns and prayers in the diary. So and goes to, I think they have informal church services along the way, kind of thing.
But he would have heard the muezzin cry 5 times from the Temple Mount, from
So there's also a Christian population there at the time,
yes,
of course. So, but nonetheless, it's.
But the city would have felt. Would have felt overwhelmingly Ottoman Muslim.
Yes.
The whole rhythm of the city and everything, much more than even today, obviously.
Yeah. So I kind of wrote about those, what I ended up calling Balfour conversations, because of other volunteers who then reported very similar conversations that they'd had, volunteers who'd gone out later in that year and reported conversations. And even one village where in the West Bank where they would normally invite people from this human rights organisation to visit. And they said, yes, you're very welcome, but if you're British, no, you are not welcome. I would like you to stay home and the rest of your teammates can come. And people told me about that experience and how troubling they'd found it and how they'd felt offended and hard to know how to react to it. But I was writing about those moments, trying to see them from the Palestinian side. So trying to see them from their viewpoint, so to be living in Palestine in the West Bank today, seeing a representative of a country has opened the door to the division of their land and opened the door to the way that they're living under an occupation today because of those events.
Well, listener, we hope you're enjoying our conversation with Bethany. We went on for a long time, covered loads of different topics, so we thought this was a good place for a break, and we'll see you in part 2. You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Told ya.